I was sitting in my living room during a summer heat wave, sweating through my shirt, when the power went out. Not just a flicker, a full blackout that lasted 3 hours. By the time the electricity came back, the milk in my fridge had already started to curdle, and the butter was a puddle. I threw away at least $20 worth of food that day, and I thought to myself, there has to be a better way. I started researching ancient cooling methods, the kind people used before electricity existed. I found out about evaporative cooling, clay pot refrigerators, and even a simple technique called the pot-in-pot method that has been used in Africa for centuries. The concept is brilliant. You place a smaller clay pot inside a larger one, fill the gap with wet sand, cover it with a damp cloth, and as the water evaporates, it pulls heat away from the inner pot. It can keep vegetables fresh for days without a single watt of electricity. I was fascinated. I decided to build one myself. The materials cost me about $30. A commercial mini fridge would cost me at least $150. That meant I could save over $100 and have a working cooling system that never needs power. But I had never worked with clay before. I had never built anything from scratch. I had a bag of sand, 2 terracotta pots, a piece of cloth, and a lot of skepticism. So I decided to test this ancient hack for myself. And what I discovered over the next week completely changed how I think about refrigeration and about the thousands of years of human ingenuity we take for granted. This is not a sponsored video. I bought every material with my own money. And honestly, I wish I had known about this years ago. Let me give you some context about how much energy we waste on cooling. Refrigerators account for about 15% of an average home's electricity usage. In the United States alone, residential refrigerators consume over 70 billion kilohertz annually. That's enough power to run the entire country of Switzerland for a year. And most of that energy is spent keeping our food cold, at temperatures that are far colder than they need to be. The pot-in-pot method, also known as the zeer pot, works on the principle of evaporative cooling. When water evaporates from a damp surface, it absorbs heat from its surroundings. In this case, the wet sand between the 2 pots draws heat out of the inner pot, keeping the contents cool. The efficiency depends on the ambient humidity and airflow. In dry, arid climates, this method can lower the temperature inside the pot by up to 20 degrees Celsius. That's 36 degrees Fahrenheit. For a simple clay pot, that's incredible. I bought 2 terracotta pots, one large, one small. The large one was about 14 inches in diameter, and the small one was about 10 inches. I also bought a bag of coarse sand, a piece of cotton cloth, and a thermometer to track the temperature. The total cost was about $30. I took a before photo of the small pot, filled with a few vegetables and a bottle of water, sitting in the sun. Then I started building. I placed the small pot inside the large one, centered it, and filled the gap between them with sand. I packed it tightly, making sure there were no air pockets. Then I poured water over the sand until it was fully saturated, but not flooded. The sand should be wet, not swimming. I covered the whole contraption with a damp cloth, letting the edges hang down into a tray of water to keep the cloth continuously moist through capillary action. Then I placed the entire setup in a shaded, breezy spot on my porch. The first few hours, I checked it obsessively. The sand was still wet, the cloth was damp, but the temperature inside the small pot was only about 5 degrees cooler than the outside air. I was disappointed. I thought I had done something wrong. But then I realized I was checking it too often. Every time I lifted the cloth, I let in warm air and disrupted the evaporation process. I needed to be patient. I left it alone for 12 hours. The next morning, I went out and checked the thermometer. The outside temperature was already 90 degrees Fahrenheit. The inside temperature was 74 degrees. That's a 16-degree drop. I couldn't believe it. I opened the small pot and looked inside. The vegetables were still crisp. The water bottle was cool to the touch. It wasn't ice cold, but it was noticeably cooler than the ambient air. I put my hand inside, it felt like a cool cellar. Not a refrigerator, but a cool natural storage space. I decided to test it with milk. I poured a cup of milk into a jar and placed it inside the pot. Then I left it for 24 hours. The next day, I opened it and sniffed the milk. It smelled perfectly fresh. I tasted it. It was still good. That was a success. I tested it with eggs, with butter, and with a few leafy greens. All of them stayed fresh for at least 3 days. In a normal room temperature, milk would spoil within 8 hours. The pot kept it good for 3 days. That was a massive improvement. But I wanted to know if this was truly comparable to a real fridge, so I ran a side-by-side test. I put a bottle of water in my electric mini fridge and another bottle in the clay pot. After 6 hours, the fridge bottle was at 40 degrees, the clay pot bottle was at 72 degrees. The fridge was clearly colder. But the clay pot was still 30 degrees cooler than the outside temperature, which was over 100 degrees that day. The fridge used electricity. The clay pot used nothing. The fridge cost me over $100 to buy. The clay pot cost me $30. The fridge requires constant maintenance. The clay pot just needs water every few days. But there was a catch. When the humidity rose above 60%, the cooling effect dropped dramatically. In a humid climate, the water evaporates slowly, and the temperature inside the pot might only drop by 5 or 10 degrees. In an arid climate, it works beautifully. In a humid one, it struggles. I also learned that the sand needs to be re-wet every 2 to 3 days. If you forget, the pot stops cooling and your food starts to spoil. And if you live in a place with high humidity, this method is not going to replace your refrigerator. But for a camping trip, a power outage, or a remote area without electricity, it is a lifesaver. I decided to take it a step further. I wondered if I could improve the cooling by adding a fan. I placed a small battery-powered fan next to the pot to increase airflow. The temperature inside dropped another 5 degrees. Not huge, but noticeable. I also tried using a finer sand, which increased the surface area for evaporation, and it improved the cooling by another 2 degrees. So the method is adjustable. You can tweak it based on your conditions. Now, let me give you the final numbers. A commercial mini fridge costs about $150. My clay pot refrigerator cost $30. That is a saving of $120. But the savings are not just financial. I also saved myself from the anxiety of spoiled food during a power outage. I saved myself from relying on electricity for basic preservation, and I saved myself from the guilt of throwing away food that could have lasted longer. However, I have to be honest about the limitations, but the clay pot fridge cannot freeze anything. It cannot keep meat or fish safely for more than a day. It cannot work in a humid climate, and it requires constant attention. You have to check the water and the cloth every day. But for vegetables, fruits, dairy, and leftovers, it is a genuinely viable alternative. I also tested it with a few other containers, a plastic bucket, a metal bin, and a glass jar. None of them worked as well as the clay pot. The terracotta is porous, which allows the moisture to wick through the walls and evaporate evenly. Plastic and metal don't have that property, so the material matters. The pot-in-pot method is not just a hack, it's a science. The ancient Egyptians knew this, the Romans knew this, and we've forgotten it because we have an abundance of electricity. But if the power grid ever fails, this simple clay pot will be more valuable than any generator. Does this homemade mini fridge actually work? Yes. It keeps food fresh, it uses no electricity, and it costs almost nothing to build. Is it as good as a real fridge? No. It cannot reach freezing temperatures, it is slower, and it is humidity dependent. But for what it is, it's remarkable. Should you try it? If you are looking for a cheap, sustainable cooling solution, or if you just want a backup for emergencies, absolutely. But don't expect it to replace your kitchen refrigerator. Think of it as a natural cooler that gives you extra days of freshness, not a replacement for modern convenience. The most important thing I learned from this experiment is that some of the most powerful technologies are the ones that don't require power. We are so conditioned to plugging things in that we forget how much we can do with just soil, water, and a little bit of physics. And that lesson is worth more than any appliance. If you enjoyed this experiment and you want to see more real tests like this, you need to commit to this channel right now. Subscribe to Overlooked and hit that notification bell, because I test the hacks that nobody else dares to try, and I show you the truth, whether it works or fails. Trust me, you will not want to miss the next experiment. If you have ever built a clay pot fridge, or if you have any other off-grid cooling hacks, let me know in the comments. I genuinely want to hear your experiences, good or bad. Thanks for watching. And remember, sometimes the best cooling system is the one you build with your own hands. You just have to be willing to try. See you in the next one.